Today we are in conversation with speakers from two cities that are part of ITDP's Cycling Cities campaign, Zapopan, Mexico, and Bengaluru, India. We'll be discussing the experience of implementing temporary and permanent cycle lanes in the past several years and what that meant in terms of the processes and lessons learned in these two unique regions. But first, I have a quick technical note. We are offering live interpretations in Spanish, and you can access those by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and making the selection for either English or Spanish, depending on the need. Additionally, you can also follow the live transcription and closed captioning during the webinar available in English by clicking the CC icon, which is also found in the control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then finally, as usual, this session is being recorded and we'll be rebroadcasting it on our YouTube channel. Today's session is a moderated conversation with the cycling cities, and I'm happy to introduce to you Dana Yanoka, who is the research manager at ITDP Global and the coordinator for the Cycling Cities campaign. We'll be using the Q&A function to draw some questions from the audience that Dana will incorporate, so feel free to add yours at any point. And Dana will start with sharing a little bit about the purpose of the Cycling Cities campaign and the different activities and exchanges we have been having with different cities. And she'll also introduce today's speakers. So with that, I'll just pass it on to Dana.
Thanks so much, Amona. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. It's great to see so many people from so many different cities joining. I just wanted to take a moment to frame today's conversation before I go ahead and introduce our great speakers that we have with us. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with our Cycling Cities campaign, this is a global campaign led by ITDP, where we're really looking to expand access to high quality protected cycle lanes around the world. And we're also working to really elevate cycling as an affordable, reliable, and safe transport mode, not only in conversations with city officials, but also at the national and international levels as well. Alona, you can go to the next slide. So we're working through the campaign with this great cohort of 30 cities, mostly from the global south. You can see all of the cities that we're working with on this map. And all of these cities have committed to redesigning and reprioritizing their streets to support more people on bicycles. And we're also working with a number of partner organizations, more than 40, in fact, who have been really key to engagement and implementation on the ground, really helping to support these cities as they move their plans and projects forward. So a big part of the Cycling Cities campaign is knowledge sharing within this network of cities and partners. And we're really trying to identify and elevate successful projects and stories to expand this bank of evidence that we can point to and really say that investing in cycling is a transport solution, it is a climate solution, and it is an equity solution. So today's conversation is really an opportunity to expand on these conversations that we've been having. So you'll notice that the title for today's webinar is Cycling Cities Stories, and we're really interested in digging into the stories behind the policies and the stories behind these actions that cities are taking. So today we're going to be talking about why these cities made some of the decisions that they did and what they learned so that we can start to replicate these good practices in other places and also avoid some of the barriers and pitfalls that have made advancing cycling a lot more challenging. So I'm really grateful to be joined today by representatives who will be sharing perspectives from two of our cycling cities, Zapopan, Mexico, and Bengaluru, India. So I first want to introduce our colleagues from Mexico. First, we have Mercedes Paloma Cruz Vasquez. Mercedes has been the Director of Mobility and Transportation for Zapopan since October 2021. In this role, she collaborates with different actors to promote measures to mitigate the climate crisis and promote safer, more inclusive and accessible cities. She was previously Deputy Director at the Urban Development Office of the state of Jalisco, and she also advocates as a member of the civil society collective Ciudad para Todos. We also have with us Jesus Carlos Soto Morfin. Jesus is currently the Director of Mobility and Transportation for the municipality of Guadalajara. He previously served as Director of Mobility and Transportation for Zapopan from 2015 to 2021. And he also participates in civil society advocacy for sustainable mobility and equity in Guadalajara. So Mercedes and Jesus, thank you so much for being here today. Please add anything I may have left out of your introductions, and take a few minutes to sort of set the stage for us, tell us about cycling and mobility in Zapopan, and just a little about the city's approach to temporary cycle infrastructure.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación a todos los que
Thank
nos
you
están
so much for the invitation. Thank you, everyone.
¿Qué tal, Carlos? Bueno, voy a empezar.
Hi, Ankit. Hi, Carlos. So I will briefly give you some context about Zapopan. Zapopan is a small municipality in the state of Jalisco, which is located in the northwest part of Mexico. We are in the northwest part of the city of Guadalajara. There are approximately 2.5 million inhabitants in our city. And we are a municipality highly marked by inequality. This is important because even if we have the highest income per capita, we also have the highest level of people living in poverty in our state. Zapopan was designed thinking about cars, just as other cities in our state. We still haven't managed to reduce the volume of cars. However, only 40% of the city's inhabitants use a car, while the rest use public transportation or a bike, or they even commute by foot. I met Jesus Carlos in the Office of Mobility and Transportation in 2015 when he was appointed director. And in 2015, we started implementing alternative means of transportation that were not based in the car. So he started analyzing the city as well as planning the urban development for the short and medium term in our city. As a result, we rank among the best 3 cities for cycling in our country. We also worked in partnership with international organizations to develop our cycle lanes. So he was the spearhead of this effort, and I will now hand it over to him to explain what happened during the pandemic. Since we already had the cycle lanes, we were able to use them during the pandemic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mercedes. Good morning, everyone. What you see in green is the cycle lanes in Zapopan. These are the cycle lanes prior to 2020 when the pandemic started in Mexico. Let me remind you that the pandemic broke out in Latin America some months after it erupted in Asia and Europe. So Upon the outbreak of COVID-19, we had already looked at international experiences. For example, the cases of Paris, Milan, Prague, who were already developing cycle lanes. And on this side of the world, there were some cases, for example, in Bogota, they had already developed 80 kilometers of cycle lanes. These were temporary cycle lanes. In 2015, we had approximately 28 kilometers of cycle lanes. By 2020, we had developed only an additional 7 kilometers, but what you see here are the three main corridors, the priorities. We identified 11 corridors in total, but we decided that we would focus on these three. We decided to develop these three pop-up lanes because they were the main access points to Guadalajara. They were also in the main avenues, and they have a high volume in transit. So we had information about the number of people who were using these roads to go into Guadalajara, and that's why we decided to develop the lanes here. We had also analyzed the intersections as well as connectivity with other cycle lanes. There were also a lot of hubs where people work, where there were some commercial areas. We also detected that there were some groups that had to commute even during the pandemic because they performed the essential activities. That's how we realized that there were approximately 300,000 low-income inhabitants in southwest Zapopan who needed to commute using public transportation in the Guadalupe Avenue. This is one of the three main avenues in our city, and that's what you see on your screen. That's why we decided it was essential to develop a pop-up lane and then to turn it into a permanent lane in a progressive way. We also determined that Mexico Avenue had to have a temporary cycle lane. The pop-up lane lasted for 2 months in the case of Guadalupe Avenue. The other two, the Mexico and Torres Avenues, were temporary for a year. They had temporary infrastructure, and then we turned them into permanent cycle lanes. This is a case of Guadalupe. However, we decided to turn this one into a permanent lane right away because we had information about it being a priority between 2017 and 2019. This is before the pandemic. We had recorded an increase in 43% in bike users. That's why the municipal authority discussed the possibility of reassigning public funds to make this cycle lane permanent. We had a budget of 16 million pesos, which is roughly equivalent to $8 million. We decided to invest this into Guadalupe Avenue. An additional 15 million pesos, roughly $7.5 million, were assigned to the Mexico and the Torres avenues. Pablo Lemus had heard of temporary cycle lanes that were being developed in other cities, and that's when he asked the Office of Mobility and Transportation to evaluate the possibility of turning our pop-up lanes into permanent ones. That's why it was a lot easier to reallocate the public funds. We started working in the Guadalupe Avenue, and we used the Crow manual, the manual from the Netherlands, and that's how we designed our cycle lanes. So, for example, in Avenida Guadalupe, we have 6 lanes in total. So we created a 1.8-meter cycle lane on the far right of the street on both ways. The lane covers 4.2 kilometers, and it is connected to main transportation hubs in one of the main roads, which is the Periférico Avenue in the outer part of Guadalajara. The reason we decided to connect the Guadalupe cycle lane to Guadalajara Avenue is that it is a high-speed area or a high-speed avenue that requires strict separation between the cycle lanes and the road itself. We invested a considerable amount during the pandemic to develop the cycle lanes and make them permanent. As you see, we started with temporary cycle lanes, and we turned them into a permanent infrastructure. What you see here is the cycle lane in Mexico Avenue. And next, we proceeded to connecting Mexico and Torres Avenues. In total, we developed 15 kilometers of cycle lanes, and by the end of these works, we had a total network of 100 kilometers. The pandemic allowed us to increase our cycle lanes by 300%. Over to you, Mercedes. Thank you so much. It seems easy, but in fact, there was a lot of resistance from some social groups. When we decided to implement the cycle lanes, we had to talk to the neighbors almost one by one. We participated in some community meetings, but even in spite of this, there was some resistance, even if we had a lot of evidence to justify these works. There was a lot of resistance, and that's why I am sharing this picture. There was a lot of resistance from the neighbors who use the cars the most. So it's 40% of the population who has a car and who refuses to lose one lane to give it up to the bikers. This picture became viral, so that's why we are sharing it today. So because it really illustrates how strong the opposition was. This is a neighbor who just threw himself on the ground in order to show his reject for our works. There were some other forms of opposition. There were sit-ins, there were some demonstrations. However, we had to talk to our strategic partners who were both the neighbors who didn't oppose the cycle lane, as well as other collectives or civil society organizations that promote mobility in the city. So they were the ones who defended the cycle lane the most. We reached an agreement, and eventually the neighbors who opposed the cycle lane gave in. Some reactions were a little more extreme than we had anticipated, but in the end, we did reach an agreement. We should say that this is a successful case. Somebody was asking us if we can say that our cycle lanes are truly accessible, and I think that this picture speaks for itself. In 2021, the Metropolitan Institute for Urban Planning of Guadalajara published a pop-up cycle lane development policy, where they mentioned that 50% of the thousands of bikers who used the lanes on a daily basis used it after the pandemic. They used it because it was practical and because it would also translate into benefits for their health. Also, 45% of non-cyclists mentioned that they would turn to using a bike if lanes were safer. And we were already very clear about this. It was very important to have independent cycle lanes to facilitate the adoption of the bike. Before developing the cycle lanes, there were some other measures. For example, in the case of Guadalupe Avenue, Jesus Carlos has already explained that it is a metropolitan avenue. In 2020, when we were developing this, there were only about 4,000 users per day. With the pop-up lanes, a couple of months later, we saw an increase in the bikers of 22%. And in January last year, the number of users had already increased by 43%. This shows that these pop-up lanes are going to become a permanent part of our streets. Also, the number of women cyclists increased when we developed the permanent cycle lane. Between 2020 and 2022, the number of women cyclists grew exponentially, even if we still have a higher number of men cyclists. The number of women who started using a bike increased by 41%. Another important topic is that in 2020, the Metropolitan Mobility Agency published the results of a survey, and they showed that we had an increase of 8,000 trips on a daily basis. In the beginning, we only had 4,000 trips per day, and after the pandemic, the use of the bike grew exponentially. I'm not sure if we still have time, but I would just like to conclude by saying that these are not the only public interventions we develop. There are some other strategies, for example, promoting civic culture in schools. We have a program for kindergarten and elementary schools where experts go and tell children about the mobility as well as the priorities and the rules in the street, so that the children understand that everybody has a right to use the street and not only cars. Currently, the main cause of death in our children and adolescents are traffic accidents. So it's important to raise awareness about this. We are also engaging in climate action, as well as fighting against the inequality with these types of interventions. Thank you so much. We still have a lot to do, but this is what I would like to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesus and Mercedes. It's really great to see and have that context from Zapopan, and certainly planted some seeds on some topics we want to follow up on as part of the discussion. So I want to go over to our other speaker today, Ankit Bhargava, representing Sensing Local, which is an urban living lab in Bengaluru, India. Ankit's work is really focused around tackling civic and environmental challenges in cities. He's an architect, he's an urban planner, and he has over a decade of experience in spatial planning, urban governance, and architecture projects. So welcome, Ankit. Thanks so much for being with us today. And I invite you to take a couple of minutes and give us a bit of background and context on cycling and mobility in Bengaluru, maybe a little bit more about how your organization works with the city, and how Bengaluru has approached temporary cycle infrastructure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I was so impressed with everything that I saw earlier, and I was like, why don't we have governments like this? And it's really nice that you played this, because I'm going to unfortunately show you a different side. So at this point in Bangalore, there is only 6.8 kilometers, even if you round it off to 7 kilometers of protected cycle lanes in the city. This is the status of a city that is 1.4 million people. And so cycling has not been a priority for us at all. And the excuse that always comes up is that the roads are very thin. And so you can't cycle. You can't take away space from cars. That is the ultimate excuse for everything. Incidentally, our public transport, our bus system has not grown either in years. So there's a lot of fight. I think when I hear the word inequality, I keep thinking that, hey, despite all of that, you made what you did happen with the cycle lanes. But somehow we are not able to make this happen. And so I have a couple of images that I do want to show you of the pop-up lanes that came during COVID. And I will also show like one or two images of what we are doing now. But so basically, yeah, this is cycle lanes. So Bangalore has been trying to build hyper-local cycle lanes from 2010-11 onwards. And we were just doing a little maths that there has always been announcements of saying we're going to build 30-kilometer cycle lanes, and then you end up building 10. And within a year or two, nobody hears about where they've gone. And so there has been a cyclic process of many, many times where there have been announcements of cycle lanes, there has been effort, and that effort just somehow erodes and leads to nothing. And so in a city that has 12,000 kilometers of roads, 7 kilometers of cycle lane is not justified from any means, where so much of the population is still moving around through walking and cycling. I think the COVID was a shake-up for us, because in a way, looking at the global movements, our national government and city governments kind of really started prioritizing cycling. And Bangalore was one of the first cities to kind of build pop-up cycle lanes. So in a way, it was a good thing that we did it. And this is an image of what came up. And in our initial discussions, we were also talking about what is a pop-up lane. I mean, how do you differentiate between a permanent and a pop-up? And so what you see here is there was 17 kilometers of cycle lane, pop-up cycle lane that was created on the outer ring road. So as you know, ring roads are around the city. A lot of traffic in commuting traffic in Bangalore is towards the outside, because the big businesses, IT campuses, Bangalore is a very heavy IT sector. We call it the Silicon Valley of India. And all of these businesses are mostly on the periphery. And so a lot of commute that's happening is on these peripheral ring roads. And since there was a lot of motivation to push for a non-motorized transport, the cycle lane actually came up, which was done by BBMP, the municipality, and the Transport Planning Authority, which is DULT. And they announced a 35 kilometer cycle lane, but they built 17. And this is what it looked like. So it was bollards, and the width was just 1.5, and it was 1.5 meters, and it was for two-lane cycle track. And the pavement on the other side is 1 foot. It's 30 inches. It's that high. And there was barely any signages along the way. You can see one signage in a distance in green in color. And this is what we got. The cycle lane lasted two years. And then we had the metro agency and the water utility agency. I think they also blamed the electrical agency, I suppose, which kind of just removed these barricades itself. So I want to show you an image that was just published by an organization that is championing something called bicycle mayors across the world. And one of them for Bangalore published this image where these are the barricades that were put on those outer ring road that were removed by the metro and other agencies. And you can see the mountain of them piling up. So the pop-up lane in our imagination was the entry of the city into finally investing in cycle lanes for the first time. And yet what we have seen is that because of the resistance to take up road space, like here we did it on the service lane of the ring road. It wasn't done on the major ring road. And the service lane, we were kind of eating up, like according to vehicles, we were eating up space for the vehicles. And so there was a lot of resistance by motor vehicle people that, look, you're taking up space, it's not going to be good. On the other hand, the 1.5 meter lane was a very bad design from a cyclist perspective also, because when you were riding, you would constantly, especially for new riders, you would feel like you would bang into it. And so it really served nobody in the end. And yet, even championing this was the hardest task ever for the government to even just invest it in. Cut to 2022-23, this also does not exist. And that's the reality of it, that when we have invested in these temporary measures, they're, even despite everything, because they're not done with enough courage and enough systems around it, we do not see conversion. As Sensing Local, we mostly work on environmental issues across the city and across other cities. We have been looking at sustainable mobility primarily because of the push for COVID, both in walking and cycling. The images I'm going to show you is from a neighborhood called Dodanakundi. It's literally the neighborhood which gives Bangalore the name of Silicon Valley. And so it's the neighborhood that has been receiving a lot of people coming from other parts of the city to come for work here. That's what the pop-up lane was serving to. That's the population. So what we were doing was, at the same time, we did an academic studio where we really designed small networks of hyper-local cycle lanes and really pitched for the first time, the first comprehensive sort of neighborhood cycle network. And that got actually funded by the government as part of a neighborhood sustainability grant. And so this, over the last 2 years, we have fought to get these cycle lanes, and we have only managed to get 1.5 kilometers of cycle lanes. And this is the struggle. I mean, I wish we had struggled and got 20 or 30 or 40, but we only got that much. And you can see this is what the lane looks like. Let me show you a slightly better picture. So there's a cyclist. There's a cyclist there. And incidentally, we also put bicycle counters there. So the counter has shown us that there are 500, 600 cyclists on each of these roads. So these cyclists exist. And the stakes from the other side are always like, there aren't enough people. Where are the cyclists? Where are the cyclists? And so you don't want to put the money there. But this is a picture from just a few days later where these electrical motorbikes are parked inside the cycle lane. And just, I think, a day later or so, we had seen that the barricades were broken because vehicles had banged into the barricades. And so even though we are calling this permanent doesn't look like permanent. For me, it kind of resembles the pop-up lanes that we are still describing. And we still are not seeing the commitment towards them being permanent, because they can just go. Like we did the lane marking a month ago. We were standing there at 12 o'clock in the night and getting these lane markings done. And 2 days later, the metro agency came and removed all the lane markings. And so this thing of understanding that something temporary is there to test, and hopefully will be test all of the elements that actually work so that we can build permanent. We still are not seeing this narrative internalizing within government. And so when we are talking about building cycle lanes like these, the bollards are experimental bollards. They are experimenting with 3 different bollard design at the same time. We still don't have a system for comprehensive dual language, that's Kannada and English, signage that is to come up. We still don't have standards that are being designed. We still don't have junction designs that are standardized. So for us, I still feel like even though they're being termed permanent now, they're still struggling with understanding basics and understanding what it takes. So this is where we are right now in the city. We are hoping to complete this network of cycle lanes about particular neighborhood. We're hoping that a lot of the learnings from here can teach us about how we do better, safer sort of cycle lanes in the future in the city. Because trust me, even though Bangalore is here, a lot of the cities are still not here. So this is just a glimpse of where we are at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ankit. It's really I think it's really useful to hear your candid analysis of how the past couple of years have gone. And I think there, like you said, are a lot of cities in this position that, have built a little bit of momentum from, these temporary lanes, but aren't quite sure what to do with that or how to establish a more, thought out plan for making these things permanent and expanding them. I think you brought up, Ankit, this idea of coordination. I think that's something that the team from Zapopan also talked a little bit about that I want to follow up on a bit. So maybe both of you can talk a little bit about how coordination advanced or the lack of coordination has led to some challenges around how temporary infrastructure was initially implemented, and if coordination between agencies or between other stakeholders has played a role in actually getting this infrastructure to be more permanent. Maybe I'll go to Zapopan first, Jesus or Mercedes, if you have some thoughts on that.
Bueno, ha habido grandes retos en esto.
Of course, we have faced big challenges. However, I think that the most important thing to highlight is the metropolitan coordination that you mentioned. The metropolitan area in Guadalajara has 10 municipalities, and we were able to create a planning institute that worked with several instruments to really build a comprehensive network and be able to implement the interrelation and a structured network. In the case of Guadalajara and Zapopan became sister cities. We have an agreement and a convention. And so we worked with the same structures of the mobility and transport norms. We looked for metropolitan routes. We also have a government board and a specific agency for mobility structure, and they are in charge of the cycling lanes. And when it comes to public transport, that is in charge of the state. So they also give that attention to the metropolitan area. So it brings us positive aspects, but also challenges. They might support us in some things, for example, budgets, priorities. If I may give an example that can clarify all this, in the metropolitan area, which is Zapopan, Guadalajara, and Tlaquepaque, we have a public cycling program. And we are planning on having 60 stations more in the eastern part of Guadalajara, which I believe it's a good thing. But for the people in Zapopan, they wish they would get those 60 stations for free cycling. So we are growing in another direction, and sometimes you have to yield, you have to understand the metropolis needs and look for the best thing for everyone. That was just an example. I don't know if Jesus has something else to say. Yes, thank you. Talking about the pop-up cycle lanes in the case of Guadalupe and the other two that we planned in two other avenues, we needed to closely coordinate with other state entities. So for example, although the municipality mobility centers have their own agents, their own mobility agents that surveil the vehicle, and we needed that surveillance so that we could respect the cycle lanes from the cars, especially when it was pop-up and temporary. We needed the support from the lane police, and they are part of the state of Jalisco law enforcement. So they helped us in that surveillance. It was important to have their support so that they can also overview any speed excess and any invasion to the cycle lanes during the pop-up stage or during the construction, especially by motorcycles. Motorcycles are the ones that invade the most the cycle lanes. So it was important to have these law enforcement agents support. Also the neighbors. Some neighbors during the negotiations cycles, in order to authorize the building of the construction of cycle lanes, was to have green lights or red lights. And that was important because we had some bottlenecks, and in that stage we needed to work with the government so that we can create adjustment proposals for the red lights, so they would change the red light timing. Here we also worked with the state authority that regulates the public transport so that we can also work with any bus stops. This was also the neighbors' request to release those bottlenecks, so we were able to change some bus stops. Also, we were able to build the cycle lanes thanks to all that support, because the mobility agency does not execute this activity, but it's through the Ministry of Construction and state and municipality authorities. That's why we needed to have a very close coordination to work in the design of the infrastructure and also oversee the construction stage. So that's where we worked very closely. Also, between the mobility areas, we work together on the cycle lane that goes from Inglaterra Avenue to Mexico Avenue. This is a metropolitan cycle lane that goes from downtown Zapopan to Guadalajara. So those are several kilometers, and the municipality limit is between Zapopan and Guadalajara. So same with Guadalupe, we have metropolitan corridors that connect peripheria points with Guadalajara downtown. So we needed to plan between the two municipalities the best way to do the cycle lane structures. And finally, I think we forgot to mention in our presentation that besides the social opposition and the rejection of the cycle lanes, we were able to have the civil society support. They were on our side. They wanted the cycle lanes built, and that was also a very important tool, because besides the political conflict, the state has been able to move forward with our agenda. Other neighbors were also in favor of the cycle lane structure. I remember someone who went door to door and get on record the neighbors that said that were in favor of the cycling structure, so that they could counteract to that only one sector that was opposed to the structure.
Thank you both. It's really interesting to hear about some of the, challenging coordination that needed to happen with cycle lanes crossing different jurisdictions, and also thinking about, integration with public transit stations and with traffic calming. I want to go to you, Anki, because there's a question in the Q&A about whether there were efforts to bring the metro authorities into conversations around planning for the temporary lanes. And I want to kind of build on that and ask you a little bit more about other stakeholders that were that could have been brought in, or what Sensing Local's role was in continuing to advocate for better, higher quality infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, like historically, and in the case of the cycle lanes built during COVID, that we were not involved with. It was largely been a state level agency that does planning, policy, and some degree of design, which is DULT. And then there is the Bangalore municipality that has been implementing. So that has been always the case. So even though your municipality is the one people relate to because they are the closest to you, they are not the ones who have the capacity or the authority to design. They are simply implement. And all of the rest of the capacity is sitting with another agency. So this has been the primary sort of stakeholders in this. Yes, the metro and other agencies, mostly metro, has always been kept in the loop to say something is happening. In the case of the one I was showing you, they were told that something is being implemented, that are you redoing the road? They were asked explicitly. They said, no, we are not redoing the road. And 2 days later, they redid the road. So it's not as if coordination is the issue between us and them. There's also internal coordination that remains an issue. The cycle lane that we are involved with, which is neighborhood networks. The stakeholders that have been, so we are doing as part of a program called SUMA, which is Sustainable Mobility Accords. It is a neighborhood grant designed to infuse sustainable mobility within neighborhood. So the core anchor has been the community on one side and us who've been technical partners to that. The DULT, the state level planning and policy agency, has been the grant maker and the core government authority. The BBMP, the municipality, has been the person to ask for permission for doing any of the road work because the roads come under their area. The police traffic police is an authority that gets involved every time you try to barricade something or you're trying to do anything within the road because they do traffic management. The elected leaders from the ministers from that constituency have been an important stakeholder because elections have not been sort of conducted in the city for 2.5 years. And so we haven't had our local level, we call them wards, basically, like Bangalore's 243 wards. We haven't had that. So everything largely has been going up to the minister level, who doesn't respond necessarily to the city, but they tend to act as still pseudo authorities within that. So everything tends to go up for permissions before we can do anything. So these have been largely the stakeholders. What tends to happen is that there's a lot of drain work that happens constantly in the city for stormwater management. And there is constant digging up of electricity and internet-based cables and gas lines and stuff, because it's a very rapidly developing city and nobody talks to each other. So all of these different agencies don't come together at the city level. They come together at a much local level, like much low, at a ward level. So even though people are conversing, there are plans being made without you. They're just happening. And so this is what coordination means in this context. I also must say that it's not that the municipality, when I'm saying municipality is implementing, it is deploying its own workers to implement. Actually, we have to recruit vendors who are going to do the implementation. And this becomes very tricky because it's not just a case of coordination now, it's also a case of capacity within vendors to implement. And this kind of a thing is very, very difficult because there isn't enough capacity within local vendors to implement cycle lanes with a certain quality of work. So that has been also a major problem that we've had. I just was actually wondering, like, there is actually 2 images which you would love, if I can show you, if that's okay. Show you all, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this is an image of logo markings that we were doing on ground. And the vendors came on ground without measuring tape, chalk, or anything else to do measurements. And so there were, at one point of time with the first logo, there were 7 people on top of one logo. So this is what I mean, that on ground, this is what we are dealing with. That there are 7 people who do not know how to do this, that are often doing the job. And so like, this is the reality when it comes to, so you can design the best networks, but how does it go from the top to the end when we are not having enough budgets allocated? You're extremely cheap amount, low budgets being implemented. You're always cost cutting. Every single element is being double questioned. And then when you're implementing on ground, this is the state on ground. So yeah, I wanted to show that.
Yeah, that's interesting to see. It seems like there is, yeah, a lot of challenges related to coordination and understanding of implementation that is not coming to fruition. We're running up against the hour here, and I just want to maybe pose one last question for both of you, for both cities. And I think there was a lot of interest and momentum around pop-up cycle lanes because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of changing travel patterns and desire for more space to travel. And we saw a lot of the barriers on both the political side and sort of the public side dissipate for some time due to that momentum. And I'm wondering what the reaction to this infrastructure looks like now. Are people still demanding cycle lanes and better, higher quality ones that are more connected? Has there been sort of a shift either on the political side or on the public side in terms of support for this type of infrastructure? And what can we learn from this experience over the past couple of years? So maybe I'll go to Zapopan first, Mercedes or Jesus, if you want to respond.
Sure, thank you. I just want to say that there is a sector of the population demanding more cycle lanes, better quality. So we hope to keep that up and to continue with the project. And we still have a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of resistance to the change, but there are also valuable lessons learned. For example, we are working with the concept of building large lanes with cycle lanes, but also for the people walking on the sidewalks. We're also thinking about green aspects, so a lot of green areas, and I think that's something to congratulate. There's still a lot to do, but at least we have that in mind. We are more aware of what we need thanks to what we learned in the past. Also, it's a very generational topic, I dare to say. New generations understand environmental crisis, climate crisis, so they are more aware of their actions and how they can have an impact at the global level. So more awareness, and I think overall the infrastructures are improving. We are taking into account the lessons and the learnings. And so, Jesus, would you like to add something? Yes, thank you. A positive point is that we had important discussions regarding cycle lanes before the construction of the Guadalupe lane. These negotiations started in 2015, 2016, where we thought about permanent cycle lanes. We carried out a consultation. Well, the authorities carried out a consultation, the local authorities, and they won 4-1 to a yes permanent infrastructure against 1 no. So that set precedent in the city of Guadalajara. It was very clear at the political level that there was a very strong sector pushing for cycle lanes and cycle infrastructure. However, the opposition to the Guadalupe cycle lane was much more stronger. So although we had thought that we won that discussion and everyone was in favor of having this cycle infrastructure, we saw that that wasn't the case for another sector that still uses vehicles. And we still see that opposition and that resistance from that sector. The silver lining is that they're not well organized in most cases. So we have isolated complaints that are sent to the authorities. And on the other side, we have more citizens, organizations, civil society organizations that are better organized for a more active transport. And we also need to see the discussions on social media. Before it was the activists and technicians that would defend that, and now we have an anonymous mass of citizens defending cycle infrastructure and sustainable transportation. So that's something that gives me hope. As Mercedes says, we are seeing a deep change in society. Of course, it's generational, but it's also cross-cutting. It's intergenerational. We are seeing this transformation in the mindset very slowly, but positively.
Great, thank you. Ankita, I'm going to wrap up with some final thoughts from you on this same topic, and thinking about lessons. You know, the challenge has been perhaps greater in where you are, but are there some lessons that you can identify, or some next steps that you think would make this process more successful if it were to be replicated again?
Again, like, it's really nice to hear about the experience of Mexico. I think the one thing that occurs to me right now is that we should build a dashboard which shows how many kilometers of cycle lanes there are in different cities of the world, with a map and a population survey. Because a lot of change can only happen when you see the other side, to say, okay, this guy is doing well, why am I not doing well? And I think it's not enough to discuss mechanisms to do that. We actually have to compare and say that, look, there's a night and day difference between these efforts, and everything can be figured out. It's not rocket science. It's building cycle lanes. Incidentally, we just wrote, like, the cycling project I was telling you was just worth $60,000, but there was $100,000 grant that was rejected by the commissioner, which we wrote with one of the officials in the city. So I'm still not understanding the nature of that resistance and why we have this resistance. I think it's very important to introspect, but it's also very important to shine the light that this is not okay. This is absolutely not okay, and the world is doing better. So I think that's what I would love to do. With all the wonderful people who attended this, if we can just do a little exercise that can shine the light on all the good stuff going on, all the people that are not there, we need to see that.
Well, fortunately, ITDP is actually working to develop something very similar to what you're talking about. And I think this broader idea of tracking progress and understanding what's happening in other places is really important to continue to build momentum and build support for this type of work. So we are right at the hour, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up by turning it back over to Ivona to close us out. But just want to thank Ankit, Jesus, and Mercedes so much for joining us today and sharing your experience. It's so great to hear and to learn from you. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank all of you, the panelists, for really sharing your time to really showcase those insights from your work, from your cities, and of course the audience for joining us today. We see from the chat that there's a lot of activity and interest in this topic, and some cities are struggling with similar challenges. So we hope to bring more stories to you. With that, I also wanted to invite you to our upcoming webinar, part of the 2023 Sustainable Transport Award webinar series. We'll spotlight this year's STA honorable mention, the city of Bhubaneswar, India, and share some lessons learned from their advancements in sustainable urban mobility. But I just wanted to also mention that we will hear again from the city of Zapopan as part of the programming for the STA as well. Zapopan, Guadalajara, and Tlaquepaque are one of the three sister cities that also received the honorable mention this year. So they will be back in June to share more insights. So stay tuned. Please click on the link in the chat if you want to see the next webinar. And of course, stay tuned in terms of more webinars and more stories with the cycling cities. And with that, I just wanted to thank you all again for joining and see you again soon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.